They called it the Holy Office. But there was nothing holy about what went on behind its stone walls. In the dim cellars of Spain's grand cathedrals and royal palaces, a shadow institution flourished, a machine designed not to save souls, but to crush them. The Spanish Inquisition was not just a chapter of history. It was an empire of fear. And its true power didn't lie in its public trials or flaming stakes. It lived underground, in rooms no one was supposed to see, where screams echoed off cold stone, and the line between faith and madness dissolved. You've probably heard of the Spanish Inquisition as a punchline, a dark relic, something exaggerated by centuries of myth. But what if I told you the reality was far worse than any story ever dared to tell? Because the truth is this: those torture chambers were real. And what happened inside them was meticulously planned, legally sanctioned, and disturbingly efficient. Let's go back to Spain in the late 15th century. The year is 1478. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand have just united the Spanish kingdoms under the banner of Catholic orthodoxy. To them, unity meant purity, religious purity. Heretics, Jews, Muslims, and anyone who even whispered dissent were considered stains on the soul of Spain. So the monarchs sought a weapon, a system to root out impurity not just from society, but from the human spirit. That weapon would be the Inquisition. The papacy approved it, but it was Spain that turned it into something new, something monstrous. The Inquisition's promise was simple: confession would save your soul. But the path to confession ran through the body. When someone was accused of heresy, they weren't simply questioned. They were taken to a place deliberately designed to strip them of everything human. Interrogators called it el tormento, the torment. The accused were often taken at night. Neighbors would hear the creak of boots, the knock at the door, and then silence. Those who vanished into the custody of the Inquisition rarely returned the same. Their first destination was rarely a grand prison. Instead, they were locked in carceles secretas, secret cells built under monasteries, palaces, or cathedrals. No sunlight, no sound except the steady drip of water, the scuttling of rats, the muffled prayers of others already broken. The cells were deliberately small, so small that some prisoners could not lie down fully. The air was damp, thick with mildew and despair. Guards were instructed to show no emotion. Their job was not cruelty, but procedure. Every chain, every bucket, every rope was recorded in neat Latin script. To the Inquisition, torture was not barbarism, it was bureaucracy. And that's what makes it terrifying. Because in those dark rooms, agony was a science. The Inquisition had 3 officially sanctioned forms of torture: la garrucha, el potro, and el tormento del agua, the rack, the strappado, and the water torture. But these were not crude medieval devices. They were precise instruments, perfected through decades of holy refinement. The accused would be led into the torture chamber blindfolded. The inquisitor would sit behind a desk, flanked by notaries and priests. Before any pain was inflicted, they made the prisoner swear an oath to tell the truth, to save their soul. Then the priest would pray aloud, asking God to forgive the pain they were about to cause. And only then did the screams begin. The strappado, la garrucha, was perhaps the most common. The victim's hands were tied behind their back, a rope passed over a pulley in the ceiling, and they were hoisted into the air by their arms until their shoulders dislocated. The sound was unmistakable: the pop of joints, the tearing of muscle, the choked cry of someone realizing their body was no longer their own. Sometimes weights were tied to the feet for extra persuasion. And yet, through it all, the inquisitors insisted. This was not punishment. It was purification. To confess was to be freed. But in practice, confession was survival. When we imagine medieval torture, we think of savagery, spikes, whips, unbridled cruelty. The Inquisition's horror came from its orderliness. The notaries took notes as prisoners screamed. The inquisitor might sip wine as he dictated the wording of the confession. The air was filled not with rage, but with procedure. Even the architecture reflected it. The chambers were built beneath chapels, so that the screams would rise upward toward heaven. It was the perfect union of piety and pain. By the time the Inquisition spread across Spain, it had created an entire economy of suffering. Blacksmiths forged instruments of torment. Carpenters built racks and pulley systems. Masons constructed new cells beneath old monasteries. Torture was not a secret shame, it was a profession. And yet, for all its power, the Inquisition had one rule: no blood was to be spilled. The body could be broken, twisted, suffocated, but it must not bleed. To spill blood was to desecrate the purity of the soul's cleansing. So they devised tortures that inflicted unimaginable agony without a drop of crimson. Fire, water, rope, weight, each chosen to leave the flesh intact, but the spirit shattered. It was theology turned inside out. And those who survived carried the silence of those rooms in their eyes for the rest of their lives. Imagine the air inside those rooms. Damp stone, candle smoke, sweat, and something worse, the metallic tang of fear itself. Every surface was slick with condensation, every sound amplified. A man breathing could sound like thunder. And in the center, lit by trembling candlelight, stood the instruments of the faith. They were not crude medieval contraptions covered in spikes and gears like in horror fiction. They were precise, polished, and engineered to terrify before they ever touched flesh. The inquisitors understood something modern interrogators would later rediscover. The mind breaks long before the body does. Take the potro, known in English as the rack, a deceptively simple machine. A wooden table with rollers at both ends, ropes tied around wrists and ankles. Turn the handle, and the victim stretches. Tendons strain, joints pop, the spine arches until it feels like the ribs might crack through the skin. But the inquisitor rarely went that far. He would stop just before unconsciousness, release the tension, ask the same question again, and then, slowly, turn the handle once more. The sound wasn't screaming so much as gasping, sobbing, begging. The human body becomes a wind instrument of its own torment. Then there was el tormento del agua, the water torture. Not drowning exactly, but the illusion of it, repeated until the body believed it was dying. The prisoner was strapped to a slanted board, mouth forced open with an iron bit. A linen cloth was laid over the face, and water poured, slowly, endlessly. Each drop filled the lungs' memory, convincing them they would never draw air again. Sometimes the cloth was soaked in vinegar or urine to heighten the burning. When they stopped, the body convulsed with reflexive coughing, only to begin again. To the inquisitors, this was not cruelty, it was correction. The logic was immaculate in its madness. A true believer would not lie under torment. So if the accused confessed, it proved guilt. If they endured, it proved demonic resistance. Either way, the Inquisition was right. But not all tortures left marks or even required instruments. One of their most devastating techniques was isolation. The carcel perpetua, perpetual imprisonment, was a cell so small the prisoner couldn't stand upright or stretch out. They sat in darkness for months, sometimes years, hearing only their heartbeat and distant footsteps. Some began to hallucinate saints and demons. Others tore at their own flesh just to feel something real. When they were finally brought before the inquisitor again, they would confess to anything. Everything was recorded. Every question, every sob, every whisper of repentance was transcribed by a notary who wrote by candlelight while priests murmured prayers in Latin. There was no shouting, no chaos. Torture under the Inquisition was ritualized, as much ceremony as cruelty. Before the session, the inquisitor prayed for divine guidance. Afterward, he thanked God for the confession. To the outside world, these chambers didn't exist. Officially, the Inquisition never tortured anyone. What happened inside was called interrogation with a question. The euphemism made it sound civilized, even philosophical. But inside, faith had become a weapon of physics and muscle. The Church justified all of this with Scripture. They quoted Luke 14, verse 23, "Compel them to come in." In their interpretation, that meant compel the heretic to return to the faith by force if necessary. Saving the soul justified destroying the body. The rack, the ropes, the cloth, all were instruments of mercy. Some inquisitors even believed they were performing a holy service. They fasted before sessions, confessed their own sins, and wept after extracting confessions. But still, they came back the next day, because the system demanded it. The victims were as varied as the tortures. Jews who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of secretly observing the Sabbath. Muslims accused of reciting prayers in private. Women charged with witchcraft or healing without church sanction. Scholars whose books contained ideas too curious for comfort. One woman, records say, was tortured for saying she had seen visions of angels that were not approved by her confessor. She was stripped, bound, and suspended by her wrists until her shoulders gave way. Another man was tortured because he had questioned the purity of the Eucharist bread. His screams were said to echo for days. And yet, every act was followed by prayer. Every wound was sanctified by ritual. Even the architecture of these places reflected the hypocrisy of holiness. Inquisition headquarters in cities like Seville, Toledo, and Zaragoza often stood beside cathedrals. The same walls that echoed hymns on Sunday contained chambers of agony beneath. Priests celebrated Mass above the very floors where men and women begged for mercy. This was the true genius of the Spanish Inquisition, not its brutality, but its order. It transformed torture into theology, turning pain into proof. Outside, the people of Spain whispered stories. Some said you could hear the screams at night from behind monastery walls. Others said the Inquisition had angels guarding its gates, that the smell of incense masked the stench of human suffering. Parents warned their children to watch their words, to pray louder, to blend in. Silence became survival. And still, the machine turned. By the dawn of the 16th century, the Inquisition had evolved far beyond its original religious mission. It was no longer merely a tribunal to save souls. It had become a political engine, a mechanism of absolute control wrapped in the language of salvation. Spain was now the world's most powerful empire, stretching from the Atlantic to the Americas. And the Inquisition was its invisible army, policing not just borders, but beliefs. Its reach extended into every home, every whisper, every thought that dared to deviate from orthodoxy. The fear of the Inquisition was so profound that people began to censor themselves before speaking. To think freely became a risk, to speak truthfully, a death sentence. And that was exactly how the crown wanted it. The Inquisition gave Ferdinand and Isabella, and later their successors, a tool to silence dissent disguised as piety. It targeted not just heretics but rivals, reformers, philosophers, and anyone whose ideas might threaten the fragile unity of the empire. Religion was the excuse. Power was the purpose. Inquisitors became both priests and spies. They listened in confession, then reported what they heard. They read private letters, intercepted sermons, and raided printing presses. Across Spain, paranoia took root like a poison vine. A careless word spoken at dinner could bring the knock at the door by dawn. And when the door opened, the question began. A merchant might be accused of failing to cross himself properly. A scholar might be denounced for reading a forbidden book. A widow might be accused of witchcraft because her herbs healed too well. The accusers were often neighbors, friends, or even family, because to accuse was to survive. Denouncing others was an act of self-preservation. Silence was complicity, and complicity was death. The Inquisition understood this psychology perfectly. They didn't just want to find heretics, they wanted to create a society of informants. Fear was more efficient than force. Inside the chambers, the process followed a terrifying choreography. A prisoner would be interrogated, tortured, and eventually reconciled. Their confession was written down, signed if possible, and read publicly before the crowd. Then came the auto de fe, the act of faith. It was part execution, part theater, part sermon. The condemned were paraded through the streets in long lines, wearing sanbenitos, cone-shaped hats, and yellow robes painted with devils and flames. The crowd gathered in plazas, priests chanting hymns as drums rolled. The air was thick with incense and smoke from the torches. The inquisitors sat on raised platforms beside the magistrates, their faces hidden under black hoods. The accused were forced to kneel and confess their sins once more before the people. Some were forgiven and sentenced to imprisonment or exile. Others were relaxed to the secular arm, a polite way of saying handed over to be burned alive. The burnings themselves were often public festivals. Families brought food, vendors sold wine and bread, children sat on shoulders to see better. To watch the fire consume a heretic was to witness the triumph of faith. The flames were called the light of God. Even in death, the Inquisition claimed ownership of the body. Ashes were collected and scattered so that no relic of a heretic could survive. Their names were struck from church records. They became ghosts erased from both memory and flesh. But if the fires ended the heretic, they also burned the soul of Spain. Writers, scientists, and philosophers fled the country, seeking refuge in Italy, France, or the Low Countries. Those who stayed learned to speak in riddles, to hide meaning behind metaphor. The Spanish Renaissance withered under the weight of censorship. Books that questioned church authority were banned, burned, or rewritten. Even translation of the Bible into Spanish was outlawed. To read scripture in your own tongue was to risk your life. Yet the Inquisition wasn't content with controlling the living. It sought to purify the dead as well. Exhumations became common. The bones of the condemned were dug up and burned posthumously, their remains scattered to deny them rest. The machinery of fear was total. And while the public imagined the Inquisition as a noble defense of faith, its inner workings revealed something else entirely: a bureaucracy of pain. Each tribunal kept meticulous ledgers, lists of names, charges, confessions, punishments, all copied in triplicate. Every rope, every candle, every chain was accounted for in official budgets. Torture had receipts. Death had documentation. The divine ledger balanced neatly in ink and blood. By the time Spain began to colonize the New World, the Inquisition traveled with it. The same ideology that fueled conquest also sanctified cruelty. In Mexico, Lima, Cartagena, the same cells, the same instruments, the same screams. Heresy now included native traditions, local gods, anything that didn't fit the empire's image of Christian purity. Inquisitors justified it all with the same prayer, Deus vult, God wills it. But as the centuries passed, something began to shift. The fires burned lower. Europe was changing. Science and reason began to challenge the old dogmas. Philosophers in France whispered that the Inquisition was not divine justice, but divine madness. Writers in England mocked its cruelty. And yet, in Spain, the silence endured. The people had lived too long in fear to speak freely. By the late 17th century, even the inquisitors themselves began to question their mission. They recorded fewer burnings, fewer tortures, but the machinery remained. Like a beast too large to kill, it continued out of inertia. And behind monastery walls, the chambers stayed ready, candles waiting for the next soul deemed unclean. The Inquisition had become not a flame, but an ember, still hot enough to burn, but too dim to light anything at all. If you read the surviving transcripts of those interrogations, the first thing that strikes you isn't the violence, it's the language. The records are written with the calm precision of accountants, each word measured, detached, almost wholly in its order. There's no mention of agony or blood, just phrases like the accused responded with tears, or the question was applied thrice, moderately. The word moderately appears hundreds of times in Inquisition documents. It's chilling. Moderate pain, moderate suffering, moderate torment. That word hides oceans of cruelty. When the condemned were led into the torture chamber, they were not met by raging executioners or wild sadists. They were met by men of faith, priests and scholars, who believed they were saving souls. That's what makes it so disturbing. The inquisitor was rarely a monster in appearance. He was polite, soft-spoken, pious. He often offered water or prayer before beginning. He would speak of mercy even as the victim screamed for it. It's easy to imagine evil as something monstrous, but here evil was clerical, methodical, prayerful. The inquisitors followed a strict process, and that process became the weapon. The rules said that torture could not cause irreparable harm. So dislocated shoulders, broken joints, ruptured muscles, these were all acceptable. Death, however, was forbidden. The victim had to survive, at least long enough to confess. One of the most disturbing accounts comes from the secret archives of Toledo. A man named Juan de Cazalla was accused of heresy for owning a book of Erasmus, a theologian whose writings questioned certain church practices. The record states, he persisted in his obstinacy. The question was applied in the manner of water. What follows is a description of water poured slowly, methodically, with pauses for prayer. His body convulsed, his lips bled from the bit, and still he did not speak. On the third day he confessed, not to heresy, but to lying about owning the book, simply to make the pain stop. His confession was accepted. His soul, they said, was saved. He died 2 weeks later from infection. Some historians argue that inquisitors did not enjoy torture, that it was merely duty. But the same records show notes scribbled in margins, small comments about unusual stubbornness or admirable endurance. The tone suggests curiosity, even pride. The Inquisition wasn't just an institution, it was a laboratory for control, and those who endured it became its greatest evidence. When the prisoners broke, when their voices finally gave way to confession, it reinforced the illusion that the Inquisition was just. See, they would say, the sinner admits his guilt. The body cannot lie. But the body lies all the time under enough pain. It will say anything. Some of the most haunting confessions came from people who invented sins simply to die faster. Women claimed to have consorted with demons. Men confessed to desecrating altars, poisoning wells, even conspiring with Satan himself. None of it true, all of it born from agony. And when those confessions were read aloud in public, the crowd believed them. It confirmed their worst fears, that evil was everywhere, that the Inquisition was necessary. The cycle of fear fed itself. Inside the chambers, the line between faith and madness blurred completely. Victims began to see visions, and inquisitors recorded them with fascination. Some claimed to see angels urging them to endure. Others saw demons mocking them. One woman, tortured for witchcraft, said the Virgin Mary appeared in the corner of the cell and wept with her. The inquisitors noted the vision, debated whether it was divine or diabolical, then ordered the torture to continue. This was not merely punishment, it was transformation. Torture was meant to destroy the old self, to strip the soul bare. When the victim confessed, they were reborn, not into freedom, but into submission. And then came the silence. After confession, the prisoner was left alone in darkness for days, sometimes weeks, to reflect upon their sin. The body trembled, the mind fractured, and when they were brought out again for their sentencing, they often smiled. The Inquisition took this as proof of repentance. In truth, it was the final symptom of madness. For some, the end came at the stake. For others, in the dungeon. A few were released, shattered remnants of who they had been, living warnings to everyone else. They walked through towns like ghosts, their backs twisted, their eyes hollow. Even the executioners paid a price. Some records mention inquisitors collapsing in mid-session, muttering about shadows following them, hearing whispers in empty corridors. Priests who spent their lives inside those chambers sometimes refused confession in their final hours, claiming their sins were too great for forgiveness. Yet the system never stopped. It fed on itself. The Church declared that pain purified the soul. But in truth, the Inquisition was purifying something else, the fear that the Church itself might not be infallible. Every tortured body was a sermon about obedience. Every confession was proof that doubt could be eradicated. And in that sense, the Inquisition was terrifyingly successful. It created a society where people no longer needed chains to stay silent. The walls of its torture chambers were stone, but the real prison was invisible, and it lived in the mind. The Inquisition believed it would last forever. Its power was divine, its authority absolute, its purpose unquestionable. But no empire of fear can survive forever, not even one built in the name of God. By the late 18th century, the world had changed. The Enlightenment swept across Europe like a storm, carrying dangerous ideas: reason, skepticism, human rights. Philosophers began to question the very notion of divine authority. They asked, if truth comes from reason, what place does torture have in discovering it? But in Spain, the Inquisition clung on, its roots too deep to tear out easily. While France had overthrown kings and burned churches, while England embraced science and philosophy, Spain remained haunted by its past. The Inquisition had become an institution so ingrained that even reformers feared to speak against it. Yet small cracks began to appear. The first came from within. Priests and friars, once defenders of the Inquisition, began to whisper doubts. Some refused to participate in interrogations. Others secretly helped prisoners escape. And in the royal court, new thinkers, educated abroad, touched by modern philosophy, questioned how an empire that claimed to bring civilization to the New World could still rely on medieval cruelty at home. Reports began to circulate of torture gone too far, of prisoners who died in interrogation, of inquisitors enriching themselves by confiscating the property of the accused. The holy image began to rot from within. When Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808, his armies didn't just bring war, they brought the Enlightenment with bayonets. French officers were horrified when they discovered the Inquisition's prisons. Beneath churches and monasteries, they found iron rings in walls, chains still hanging, bones scattered in forgotten pits. One French officer wrote, "We entered the sanctuaries of hell, and hell smelled of incense." Under French occupation, the Inquisition was officially abolished for the first time in 1808. But when the French retreated, it was restored almost immediately by the Church. The old beast refused to die. Still, the tide of history was against it. The very ideas it had tried to suppress, reason, liberty, the value of the individual, had taken root even in Spain. The world no longer feared heresy as it once did. It feared ignorance. In 1813, the Spanish Cortes, the National Assembly, voted to abolish the Inquisition again. The Church protested, the Vatican raged, but the institution was wounded beyond repair. By 1834, under Queen Isabella II, the Spanish Inquisition was permanently dismantled. Its files were sealed, its chambers closed. But the legacy didn't vanish. When historians and archaeologists began opening those sealed chambers centuries later, what they found was more horrifying than legend. Rooms carved from stone, ceilings blackened by candle soot, walls etched with fingernail scratches that formed desperate prayers, chains still bolted to walls, iron collars hanging from hooks. Beneath some monasteries, shallow pits filled with bones too numerous to count. The air inside those rooms was said to be colder than the rest of the building, as if centuries of suffering had seeped into the stone. The instruments, long rusted, still carried the memory of touch. The rack, the pulley, the board used for the water torture. Even the paperwork survived, ledgers written in perfect Latin describing each question, each confession, each reconciliation. Reading them, you sense the chilling efficiency of the system. It wasn't chaos. It was order. Every act of agony had been approved, documented, justified. And when those records were published, Europe recoiled. The myth of holy justice was shattered forever. The Inquisition's reach had been enormous. Thousands executed, hundreds of thousands imprisoned, countless more living under its shadow. And yet, its victims were not just the dead. They were generations of minds, silenced, broken, reshaped by fear. The Spanish philosopher Miguel de Unamuno later wrote, "The greatest crime of the Inquisition was not the deaths it caused, but the life it prevented." Even after its end, echoes of its ideology lingered. Every regime that sought to control thought, to define truth, to force confession, every dictator who equated obedience with purity, was in some way its descendant. The Inquisition never really disappeared. It evolved. Today, the old torture chambers are museums. Tourists walk through them in silence, eyes wide as they stare at the instruments displayed behind glass. Audio guides whisper descriptions of what was done there. You can almost hear the sound of dripping water, the creak of rope, the muffled cries that once filled the air. But perhaps the most chilling part isn't the tools or the bones. It's the realization that the people who built these rooms thought they were righteous. That the line between faith and fanaticism, between devotion and destruction, is thinner than we'd like to believe. The Spanish Inquisition wasn't the work of monsters. It was the work of men, educated, devout, convinced of their moral duty. And that's what makes it timeless. The torture chambers may be empty now, their candles extinguished, their instruments rusted, but their lesson endures. When power convinces itself it acts for the greater good, there is no limit to the cruelty it can justify. In the end, the Inquisition didn't protect faith. It destroyed it. Because once belief requires chains, fire, and fear to survive, it's no longer faith at all. It's tyranny dressed as salvation.